Sorry
Can you hear me?
about that. Go for it.
Are we good?
Yes,
So
I'm sorry. And I would now like to introduce Attorney at Law for Fisher & Phillips, Whitney Sellert.
Okay, thanks, Rhea. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the Chamber for asking me to speak with you this morning. As Rhea mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about some changes from the Department of Labor that might significantly affect your business labor costs. These changes take effect on December 1, and we've been getting lots of inquiries from business owners all around the country about just what these changes mean, and the Chamber's asked us to give you the lowdown on that. If you're not familiar with our firm, Fisher & Phillips is one of the oldest labor and employment firms in the country. We've got offices in 29 cities around the country, including here in Las Vegas, and we exclusively represent business. I like to say we're in the business of helping business do business and stay out of trouble. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Our job of helping business stay out of trouble is getting a lot bigger, particularly with the number of new changes to existing rules and regulations that are coming down the pipe. Some of these changes, if you're not adequately prepared, can expose your business and even business owners to expensive investigations, fines, and lawsuits. This morning I'm going to speak to you about one change in particular from the Department of Labor that specifically applies to overtime rules and whether and when employers are required to pay overtime to their employees. These rules haven't been changed since 2004, but these new revisions are expected to affect almost every employer in at least some way. The Department of Labor estimates that about 4.5 million employees who currently don't receive overtime are going to be entitled to overtime under this new rule, which they also anticipate should inject about another $12 billion of what would have been corporate profits into salaries or wages. So management with these changes needs to be thinking about what it means to their organization and what, if anything, they should be doing in response. Let's go to the next slide, please. The basic structure of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is what governs here, is pretty simple. There's a national minimum wage, which shouldn't be confused with our state minimum wage, which is somewhat higher at $8.25 an hour, as you know. Unless you offer insurance to your employees, then it's the same as the federal minimum wage. There's also, at the federal level, an overtime requirement, which is 1.5 times the regular pay rate whenever an employee works more than 40 hours a week. Our state law is the same, except we also have daily overtime whenever an employee works more than 8 hours in a day. It's important to remember that with respect to wage and hour issues, it's always the employer's responsibility to keep track of the hours their non-exempt employees work. If you don't do this, you can leave your business open to significant legal liabilities if an employee claims they're entitled to overtime, work the number of hours to qualify for overtime, and you as the employer can't prove otherwise. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as you know, some employees are not entitled to overtime if they meet one of the legal exemptions from those requirements. The basic rule is that nobody's exempt unless the employee clearly fits within one of these defined and narrowly construed exemptions. There are several categories of exemptions, which I won't go into in too much detail here, but some of them include things like the professionals or computer IT folks, outside sales staff, administrators, and executives, or what we commonly refer to and know as the white-collar exemptions. It's these white-collar exemptions that are affected by the new rules and regulations, and these are the changes that are going to require you to reevaluate any of your employees that you're currently only paying a salary without overtime because you think they fit into one of these categories. Next slide, please. Like I said, there's a number of these white-collar exemptions, and while they differ in important ways, they all share some same basic characteristics. They're paid on a salary basis, not hourly, so that means the employer doesn't keep track of the hours worked by that individual, and the employee doesn't punch in or punch out, and there's no overtime and generally no real reliable record of when actually somebody worked. Paying a salary is not enough. The employee actually has to perform certain types of work and activities during the day to qualify for these exemptions. And if they don't qualify, simply paying them a salary without overtime is what is known in this industry as a misclassification case, which I'll explain can become a really big problem for your business if you're hit with one of those lawsuits or investigations. Finally, with respect to salary exempt employees like these white-collar exemptions, to qualify for the exemption, the salary that you pay the employee must be at least a specified minimum. So go to the next page, the next slide, thanks. So let's just quickly, we'll take a look at the executive exemption just as an example to understand how this works. To qualify for an exemption from overtime, this executive employee's primary duty must be managing the enterprise or a department or unit of that enterprise. This type of employee must direct the work of others and have the authority to hire, fire, promote, or make other significant decisions affecting the business and its subordinates. The salary requirement must be at least $455 a week or more. Only if all of these requirements are met is that employee then not entitled to overtime. Go to the next slide. Another exemption is the administrative exemption. This is what it looks like, and you'll note some similarities to the executive exemption. This exemption also pertains to, non-manual work related to the management of the business. It also requires a significant amount of discretion and autonomy to make significant business decisions, and it has the same minimum salary requirements. Anytime you have one of these white-collar exemptions that has a minimum salary requirement, that right there, the $455 a week is what the minimum has been up until December. So this is one of the exemptions, the administrative exemption, that most employers get wrong, thinking the salary alone is sufficient to qualify for the overtime exemption. And misclassification lawsuits over this exemption is the most frequent type of lawsuit we're seeing today in federal court. It even surpasses discrimination suits in total volume. Go to your next slide, please. It's important to remember that it's the employee's duties, not the job title or written job description, that determines whether any of these exemptions apply. These are some of the types of white-collar exemptions that have been recognized already. There's what they call the learned professional. These are doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists, folks who hold specific degrees or credentials and work in those fields or as a resident or internist in those fields. The creative professionals, your painters, musicians, and screenwriters, there are specific exemptions for those. Some computer employees, as I mentioned previously, programmers, software engineers, and whatnot. And then the highly compensated individual, which is a separate exemption that's a lot like these others, but different in the sense that this individual doesn't technically meet all the requirements for other full exemptions, but makes so much more than the minimum required salary that it's basically silly to require overtime. Currently, the minimum salary to qualify for that exemption is $100,000 a year. Let's go to the next slide. So that was and has been the basic lay of the land since 2004 and will be until December 1st, 2016, when the Department of Labor's new rules go into effect. The biggest changes are to the minimum required salary for the white-collar exemptions and the minimum required salary for the highly compensated individual exemption. Both of those are going up significantly, and the Department of Labor's new rules indicate that they intend to continue raising those limits every 3 years starting in 2020. So the minimum salary for the white-collar exemption is going to go from $455 a week, which was annualized to a $23,660 a year salary. It's going to go from the $23,000 salary to $913 a week, or $47,476 a year. So that's a 101% increase to the minimum salary in order to require for that exemption that's going to go into effect on December 1. Similarly, but not quite as high of an increase, the minimum salary for the highly compensated individual exemption is also going to increase from $100,000 to $134,000 a year. So if you have any employees who otherwise meet the requirements for these exemptions, but as of December 1 won't be making these new minimum salaries, they're no longer going to be exempt and they're going to be entitled to overtime. Let's go to the next slide. It's just kind of a technical point for employees other than those in the highly compensated category. You can include regularly paid commissions. Those are what the DOL defines as non-discretionary bonuses and incentives, in determining up to 10% of the employee's total annual compensation. That means that in order to satisfy the new $47,000 minimum salary, you can take up to $4,700 of that coming from non-discretionary commissions and bonuses. In other words, if you have a non-discretionary bonus plan in place, the employee's base salary can be $43,000 a year, and so long as those non-discretionary bonuses come in above $4,700 or so, you'll be compliant. Now, the only caveat to that rule is that the bonuses and commissions have to be paid on at least a quarterly basis. You can't just wait till the end of the year and do it all in a lump. Next slide. There really aren't any exceptions for these new rules. There are a number of legal challenges in the courts currently. 21 states, including Nevada, and the United States Chamber of Commerce have all filed lawsuits, and there's been some legislation proposed to delay these changes, but it doesn't look like any of those are going to succeed or get any traction prior to the effective date of these changes on December 1. So you want to be prepared to go ahead and move forward and comply. Also, it's worth noting that if you're operating a nonprofit or you're a government employer or you're working in higher education, these rules still apply to you, but there are more specific guidelines given by the Department of Labor that you'll want to look at. Next slide. So if you've not been thinking about these new changes and you're not already taking steps to comply, you should begin by evaluating those employees that you're currently treating as exempt. For each one of those folks, you're going to want to make sure that they fit within the scope of one of the recognized exemptions. Then you're going to want to evaluate whether you want to continue treating them as exempt or whether you will treat them as hourly. If you want to continue treating them as exempt, it may require a salary adjustment, obviously. Once you've kind of gone through those steps, if you determine you want to treat someone as hourly, then you need to figure out what steps you want to take to manage that transition correctly so that you're keeping track of hours worked and making sure that you're satisfying your overtime obligations, which will then apply to that employee at their new hourly rate, or what they call the regular rate, which is a formulaic determination of what they're owed per hour that allows you to calculate overtime. Next slide. To be safe, it's always best to start with the assumption that your employee is not exempt. The Department of Labor and, frankly, most courts construing these exemptions construe them strictly and narrowly. Specific requirements are outlined for each of these exemptions, and each must be satisfied to qualify for the exemption. Also, if you're challenged by the Department of Labor, one of your employees, through a lawsuit or otherwise, it's the employer's burden to demonstrate that the exemption applies. So if you can't do this, you'll lose and be subject not only to the unpaid overtime, but also liquidated damages, fines, and attorney's fees, which, as I'll explain, is often the biggest component of loss in one of these cases. Next slide. It's important to remember that the exemptions are measured by the actual activities of the employee on the job being performed and not by the employee's job title or job description or described duties. Employers, I always caution them, should be careful not only to have very good, accurate, detailed written job descriptions, but also keep other detailed, accurate, and up-to-date information based on real work and real facts for each individual that demonstrates that they actually perform those duties and therefore qualify as an exempt employee. Too many employers, I think, rely on job descriptions or like one-size-fits-all assumptions that duties that are being performed by one employee might be or are necessarily being performed by employees in the same classification when that's not necessarily true, and those kinds of assumptions aren't going to be adequate to satisfy these burdens. If you're sued or investigated by the Department of Labor, this is exactly the kind of information they're going to be looking for, and if you don't have this type of information or these ducks in a row, more likely than not, you're going to lose the challenge. Go to the next slide, please. So there are a number of checklists available to assist in making this analysis. I've got a number of those. If you need a checklist, just email me afterwards and I'll get you one to start this analysis. And doing those checklists is great, and keeping those in your records or your employee files to demonstrate that you did this analysis in good faith is a great start. But again, I don't think that's going to be enough cover for you. the important thing I think that you want to be able to know and demonstrate is that for each employee and for each type of exemption that you think applies to an employee, you want to make an individualized analysis of the factors specific to that exemption and the realities of the duties actually performed by that employee to make sure that you satisfy those criteria. All right, go on to the next slide. So what happens if you go through all of that analysis and you determine that the employee is not exempt or was exempt but won't be unless you double their salary and you're not ready to do that? Well, there are a number of strategies or steps you can take to deal with that. You can pay the employee by the hour. You can reset their hourly rate to compensate them for the time they work and the overtime. You can pay salary as straight time compensation for 40 hours or some other number. You can pay salary as straight time compensation for all hours, including overtime. You can pay them on a commissions plus overtime basis. Or you can, depending on the type of employee, you can pay on a day rate or a job rate or a piece rate basis. Which one is correct is going to depend mostly on the nature of your business, and if you think one of these might apply to you, it'd be a good time to consult your labor or employment lawyer to make sure that whatever strategy you choose not only complies with these new Department of Labor laws, but other state and local laws. Go on to the next slide. Whichever option you choose for treating your non-exempt employees, the thing you need to realize is that once you've made that determination, it's your legal duty to keep accurate time records. You need to start by knowing what type of activities count in that regard. Depending on what type of employee, that can include time preparing for work, what they call donning and doffing equipment or uniforms, necessary equipment, or other activities that are required by the nature of the job before the employee actually begins working. Other issues such as, with exempt employees, oftentimes employers rely on them to answer emails and phone calls after hours. In a non-exempt status, all that time can be compensable. So you got to set up systems and make sure that you know and are able to accurately calculate precisely when your folks are working. You want to make sure you have an accurate system for tracking that time, and that your employees and your managers are fully trained on that system so that everybody's on the same page. Even with systems like that in place, smart employers will periodically audit themselves for accuracy in those records. So in other words, from time to time, maybe semi-annually or whatnot, you want to sit down and look at those records and maybe even discuss with the employee to confirm that everything's kosher. Next slide. So you've got until December 1 before the new rules go into effect, and likely a bit of time after that before enforcement becomes a Department of Labor priority. So you're going to want to use that time wisely and make sure you're compliant. There's going to be a lot of publicity around this law. There already is, but particularly after it goes into effect. And you can be sure that those of your employees who are being paid a salary are going to wonder if they're being paid less than $47,000 after December 1 if they're not also entitled to overtime. If it is the case that they are, you could find yourself with a pretty significant bill that you didn't have reflected in your budget. So this is a great time, really, and a great opportunity to go ahead and look over your operation, make sure you're squared away, that all of the exemptions that you're taking from overtime are legitimate, or that you're prepared to satisfy any overtime obligations that might arise if you've got to treat these folks as non-exempt. All right, next slide. If you're caught not in compliance, these are some of the problems you can face. Back wages, unpaid overtime, and liquidated damages. Liquidated damages are statutory, basically amount to twice the amount that you should have paid to begin with. Civil fines can be imposed, and you want to note that the statute of limitations, that's the time within which an employee can bring a claim for these unpaid wages, is 2 years for basic negligence cases, or 3 years if it involves a willful violation. So you can imagine that over that period of time, 2 or 3 years, unpaid wages then doubled with liquidated damages can really start to add up and present a real liability if you're required to satisfy that. Next slide, please. One of the biggest costs of any of these misclassification cases, particularly when your employee brings a legal action against you, is attorney's fees. Because not only do you have to incur attorney's fees defending yourself, but you have to pay your employee's attorney's fees, which are automatically awarded if that employee wins, even when the employee is only able to prove a very minor or technical violation, which often happens. I see many cases where the employees come in, they've got a very high expectation of the amount of money they think they're entitled to based on alleged misclassification. They throw out huge numbers. At the end of the day, we're able to successfully demonstrate that in fact they were paid appropriately, but there's some minor technical violation that is still found. And even in those cases, all the attorney's fees incurred by that plaintiff's lawyer are awarded to them. And that is where oftentimes that's the biggest component of loss, significantly higher than the actual unpaid damages. Also, in cases where there's a willful violation, the business owner can be individually liable and subject to criminal penalties in some cases. So those are just costs and risks that you might face in addition to the significant amount of time and energy that you can be forced to expend dealing with these kinds of issues, not to mention the potential negative publicity inside and outside your own business, and a host of other problems that arise from these things. So, next slide. That's pretty much my presentation. I would just emphasize, coming off that last slide, that this is really the best time for you to spend your time and energy trying to get compliant ahead of the deadline to make sure that you stay out of trouble and avoid all these potential risks and investigations and lawsuits if you can. So I'd like to thank you again for giving me this opportunity to give you the basic outline of this new law and regulation change that's coming down the pike. My partner, Scott Mahoney, is going to be giving part 2 of this on November 4th. So if you're interested and this applies to you, be sure to attend that one as well. I've got some time for questions if folks have any. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Whitney. So you all are aware this webinar will also be available for review behind the members-only portal at lvchamber.com. And again, just like Whitney said, make sure you join us next week, or sorry, yes, it is next week, for the next Chamber University on November 4th, the week after next, for part 2 of this 2-part series on the new Department of Labor rules. And again, thank you so much, Whitney, for taking your time out. And this is such great information. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask now. If not, we will go ahead and conclude the meeting. And thank you all for tuning in.